So as Gabe said, we wanted to kind of do a self-interview to give you all a sense of where, our research is and how it's developed. In my own case, I have an interdisciplinary formation. I have degrees in literature, art history, American studies. I work mostly in Latin and Latino studies, even though I teach in an English department. So I have a varied formation. But I think that one of, a really central question in my work has always been how culture is a really crucial site of class struggle. And that has involved both, undertaking a materialist analysis of specific cultural practices and cultural products, namely art, performance, other forms of expressive culture, but now that I'm working much more on kind of doing that with forms of contemporary theory. And so in my own work, as well as the collaborative work that I do with Gabriel, I've really, sought to develop a theoretical framework that's adequate for comprehending the many different ways in which cultural class struggle plays itself out, or how class struggle plays itself out in culture and ideology, and the various ways in which we are composed as social beings. We shared with you an article that we wrote several years ago on the compositional model of ideology, which is part of a larger book project that we have together called Revolutionizing Aesthetics. That is a book project in the works that deals with ideology, the cultural apparatus, and revolutionary culture. And that particular article and the idea of the compositional model of ideology seeks to provide an account of really the multi-dimensional valences of ideological processes, by which not only our thoughts, but also our perceptions, our affects, desires, and habits are all fashioned by material practices and ultimately by the socioeconomic order in which we live. So, this allows us to consider the many ways in which culture shapes our consciousness, often in ways of which we are unaware. So, the part of our interest in writing about ideology is to really promote an objective critique of ideology against just a purely subjective critique of ideology. And what I mean is that an objective ideology critique examines how individuals are situated in and are partial products of the social totality. And this is, of course, the starting point for any kind of Marxist approach to thinking about ideology and the formation of human consciousness. As Marx famously wrote in his preface to his a contribution to the critique of political economy, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness, right? So this is, the very basic starting point for understanding ideology, and I think for the kind of method that we employ in our work. So unlike this Marxist approach, a lot of theory that is circulated in the Western university instead dedicates itself solely to describing or analyzing subjective experience without inquiring into the roots of the actual organization of that subjective experience vis-a-vis class struggles that comprise the imperialist world system. And this tendency that you see in a lot of academic theory is, of course, a symptom of the rejection of Marxism and its fundamental contributions to understanding culture and consciousness. This kind of purely subjective account of ideology, of course, or concern with ideology often translates to a predilection towards individualism and idealism when it comes to imagining oppositional responses to the current order. And by idealism, I mean a philosophical approach that treats ideas and metaphysical essences as if these were the things that really moved the world, right? And so when I say that we often encounter then oftentimes these kind of idealist and subjectivist accounts of, answers to the question of what is to be done, we see that as in the kind of million different versions of the conceit that what needs to be done is we need to think differently, right? Think otherwise. You've probably come across, some version of this. I know I have, over and over and over again across the course of my training and my career. This takes a form of, that the answer is going to be just some kind of form of epistemic resistance that in and of itself would be sufficient political action, right? And that is treated, as the sole concern over and above any kind of concern for building collective forms of political action that might actually have effects. So this kind of, idealism is very evident in approaches to analyzing the political potential of expressive culture. For example, even in a lot of work that's influenced by Western Marxism, I'm thinking influenced by the Frankfurt School, you see the kind of tendency to see that just having an experience with a work of art or an experience with an idea would in and of itself be sufficiently transformative to produce some kind of social effect, right? And this kind of assumption underlies a lot of writing about aesthetics and culture. It also underlies a lot of other forms of theory that are invested solely in kind of epistemic forms of resistance. In regard to treating art in this way, this is something that Gabriel has theorized as the talisman complex in his book Radical History and the Politics of Art. And this is this idea that there's something kind of magical about a cultural product, so such that the encounter with it in and of itself would be enough to have some kind of transformative social effects. And aside from being obviously impractical notion of creating political change, the other really deep problem with such an approach is that it tends to isolate aesthetic artifacts and cultural artifacts from the material social relations in which they're embedded. Those material social relations in which they're produced, circulated, consumed, and received. So both of us have worked to critique this approach in our respective work, and also to develop alternative ways for talking about and writing about culture. So we draw very heavily on the work of Bertolt Brecht, as well as other thinkers, and to do that we've conceptualized the bourgeois cultural apparatus as the material system of aesthetic production, distribution, and consumption, and aim to also situate within this the bourgeois aesthetic ideology that often predominates in the Western theory and the Western academy. And this bourgeois aesthetic ideology is which you can find across classic thinkers, whether it's Kant or neo-Kantians or people coming from the Frankfurt School, itself tends to invisibilize the cultural apparatus, right? And it tends to invisibilize the social relations in which expressive culture is embedded. So in contrast to the kind of prescriptions of bourgeois aesthetic ideology that isolates artistic artifacts and cultural artifacts from the social world, I've been particularly interested in my own research on focusing on expressive culture insofar as it is embedded in actual political and social struggles. For me, that is a much more realistic way of understanding how cultural practices have some kind of bearing upon the social world, is when they're actually part of larger collective efforts to change that world. So a lot of my research for the past 25 years, I guess, has really focused on these types of artistic and cultural practices. And that is forms of visual art, literary work, performance that are embedded in anti-systemic struggles, movements, connected to socialist parties, and even to revolutionary movements. I initially started doing research on this topic 25 years ago when I was interested in, particularly in art coming out of the Chicano liberation movement. The Chicano movement is a social movement that emerged in the Southwest U.S. in the 1960s. That was really a movement of working class Mexican Americans that sought to gain greater political power, particularly for, and to struggle against the racism and national oppression that Chicanos are experienced. And it has produced a very vibrant artistic movement that went alongside it. That's kind of how my doing research on that topic, which is also is how I kind of initially got interested in studying political art, but also that opened up a lot of larger questions, which I'll speak about. From that research, initial research on the art of the Chicano liberation movement, I then moved on to do a lot of research on art linked to anti-fascism in South America, initially looking at work created in the 70s in the context of dictatorships in Chile and Argentina. But then I kind of quickly became very interested in focusing my research on more contemporary practices, and I wrote a book called Another Aesthetics is Possible that deals with experimental forms of political art and literature that is linked to various anti-systemic movements since the 90s, so including Zapatismo, the anti-globalization movement, the human rights movement in Argentina. And more recently, my research has kind of focused more on Cuban revolutionary culture, third cinema, and other arts coming out of national liberation struggles in Latin America. Now, my work also, I think, is particularly my work for many years on the culture of the Chicano movement and on Latino cultural production more generally. And I think that's also one of the main fields in which I teach. Also really led me to develop, I think, a particular critique of the U.S. cultural apparatus, namely its predilection for misrepresenting material struggles around political power and resources as being purely struggles over representation. We often see this in the use of the cultural expression produced by racialized intellectuals and artists that is then presented within a kind of liberal multiculturalist framework where a representational inclusion is seen as constituting the ultimate political horizon. And this approach, which I think characterizes not only a great deal of scholarship, but a lot of, curatorial practices and kind of the ways in which culture gets institutionalized and historicized. This type of approach, which again makes representational inclusion kind of the only goal or the only way of a kind of understanding what's at stake, systematically hides the class character of the institutions in which this inclusion is sought, be this a museum or be it a university curriculum. And it also, this type of approach, and particularly as you kind of see it within the U.S. liberal multiculturalist framework, also papers over the very crucial differences between the fortunes of upwardly mobile individual intellectuals and artists and the material struggles of the entire communities for which these intellectuals are treated as representatives, even though they have no actual accountability to these communities, right? And this is a kind of structure that I think we see, not only in the arts, but we see it in the academy as well. I think, the work of Adolph Reed Jr. has been really great for identifying precisely, this mechanism as kind of a hallmark of post-60s U.S. political culture. And it's in his writing on this, he talks about how one of the hallmarks of this kind of political culture is that, of course, outsized influence is accorded to members of the professional managerial class who themselves are professionally incentivized to act as spokespersons for racialized constituencies. And this leads to an easy confusion between the politics of professional advancement for this class stratum, right, which can, of course, include struggles against racism, sexism, and so on. But this, politics of the professional managerial class gets mistaken for being a mass politics that could actually be meaningful to working class interests. This type of confusion, I think, takes particularly egregious forms. I think, for example, when you see, for example, Cuban American artists who are ensconced at prestigious universities speak in the name of the Cuban people to call for the U.S. to overthrow their government. That's one example. But there's also perhaps the kind of less obvious forms that you see of this kind of structure where that really occurs in the normalization of cultural nationalism as a kind of framework for political analysis and strategy. This is something that I, in my own work, given that I work so much in ethnic studies frameworks within the U.S. Academy, is something that I come up against a lot. And there have, of course, been many robust critiques of cultural nationalism made by Marxists as well as feminists, for decades and decades. But these frameworks still really persist, not only, across ethnic studies programs, but in many forms of contemporary theory. One needs only to think of the very influential theoretical trends like Afro-pessimism or the idolization of Cedric Robinson's anti-Marxist work. And these theories, like so many other forms of nationalist thought, are often very explicit in their rejection of Marxism and Marxism's universalist approach towards seeking human emancipation. Now, as I mentioned, I think nationalist frameworks have really dominated a lot of ethnic studies frameworks, and they've certainly dominated Latino studies within the United States. And this is something that's been very interesting as well as frustrating to me. The Chicano movement, which I mentioned, gave rise to the founding of Latino Studies Department in very material ways, because those departments were only founded because student activists militated for them, going on hunger strikes, occupying universities. That's the same way that Black Studies departments and Women's Studies departments were founded. But these movements were not exclusively nationalist. Yet, they included communists, they included all kinds of Marxists of various stripes. I mean, even in the history of the Chicano movement, you have Maoists and Leninists. But the nationalist tendencies of the Chicano movement, as well as you would say, I think, of the Black liberation struggle, were those that were best able to accommodate themselves to U.S. capitalism and as well to the corporate imperialist university. And those eventually, predominated in the institutionalization of the gains that these movements made in democratizing universities, for example. So this, an understanding of this and my own kind of experience kind of working in and through this has led me to pursue one of my current projects, which is I'm currently co-editing an anthology on Latino Marxisms, a 3-volume anthology that I'm co-editing with Ben Holguin and Jaime Gonzalez, and that's bringing together a lot of contemporary work as well as reprinting some very classic work of Marxist analysis around questions of Latino history, as well as histories of Marxism and communism within the Latino political movements. So, and in the process of doing this work and editing this book, has allowed me to kind of delve even deeper into the very rich traditions of theory that are deeply concerned with national oppression, deeply concerned with racism, but that use a dialectical and historical materialist method to analyze this oppression rather than a culturalist approach. Now, this difference between a kind of dialectical and a historical materialist approach and a culturalist approach is something that is I'm going to talk about today and probably come back to when next week when I give another talk here. And when I say culturalism, what I mean by that is a tendency to treat reified cultural and ethnic features and identities as the key for explaining social conflicts, as the key for explaining historical developments. This is a tendency that interprets cultural and ideological traits in an ahistorical manner, ignoring the specificities of the historical products that gave rise to them. And when it reifies cultural identities, it treats them as essences that stand above history rather than treating them as products of history. By contrast, a historical materialist approach understands the crucial difference between, on one hand, the ideological categories that are used to justify and naturalize oppression and exploitation, including racial and national identities, and on the other hand, the concrete social forces that drive this exploitation and oppression, right? And this is a crucial distinction. as Marx wrote, it is necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic traditions of production and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. So in the approach, the Marxist approach that I'm interested in is one that understands class struggles, that is, struggles over the means and resources that ensure life, and the many forms that those class struggles take, as the basis of social conflicts, while recognizing that these, of course, present themselves in the world in concrete situations where the experience of these conflicts are mediated by ideology, right? So, of course, these ideologies have an effect in the world. Now, my current project, and I'll give you an overview of this and then I'll wrap up. My current project, which is preliminarily titled Culture and U.S. Empire, is really framed in terms of a methodological confrontation between, on one hand, these essentializing culturalist tendencies, particularly as they appear in sort of post-1960s theorizing within the U.S. Academy, and on the other hand, the historical materialist and dialectical orientation of Marxism, particularly in the heterodox forms it has taken in Latin America. In this book, I'm really especially focusing on these competing frameworks, culturalist versus Marxist frameworks, in terms of how they either elucidate or mystify the history of colonialism and neocolonialism and the causes of racism, and what some people refer to as coloniality, meaning the persistence of kind of colonial social relations after formal independence. In this book, I'm really taking as kind of exemplary of one of these culturalist approaches, the postmodernist decolonial theory that has been, really originated in the late 90s, and has been really promoted by figures like Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossfogel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and so on. I think it's a good example, though it's one of many examples of this kind of form of culturalism, because it essentially is one that attributes to epistemic difference, treats epistemic difference and the idea that there's like a Western episteme as kind of the ultimate source of these social conflicts. And it essentially has sought to displace Marxist anti-colonialism and replace it with this type of culturalist and ultimately idealist approach for understanding neocolonialism. So this is really one of the focus of my critique in this book, though I'm trying to historicize it in a way to show that it's one example of a much broader tendency, because a lot of this type of tendencies of eschewing all the contributions of the Marxist method, and specifically eschewing all of the world historical contributions of Marxist movements in the project of decolonization, that to replace these with a kind of idealist, postmodernist, culturalist answer to these same problems. This is a tendency that we see not only in decolonial theory, but you can see it in a great deal of postcolonial theory and subaltern studies, and a lot of other forms of contemporary U.S. theory that have similar roots in a lot of the same theoretical roots in the kind of rejection of Marxism, a preference for postmodernist methods and thinkers. And finally, I'll just say, so part of my project is a critique of this tendency, and the other part is really an appreciation and discussion of the really important contributions from Marxist contributions, but particularly those that grew out of national liberation struggles in Latin America. These are struggles that were, principally concerned with struggling against U.S. imperialism, and have, accordingly developed important and sophisticated analyses of neocolonialism and of the many dimensions of U.S. imperialism, including cultural imperialism. And that also inspired and produced very important forms of expressive culture, of literature, of film, that themselves are, contributing to this broader theorization of U.S. imperialism and the struggle against it. And I'll just say the other important component of this project is also these competing ways of understanding fascism, the kind of Marxist approach versus a culturalist or idealist approach. This is something that is, very organic to my own research on Latin American Marxism, because in these same struggles, national liberation struggles against U.S. imperialism, were in most cases also essentially struggles against U.S.-backed fascism in Latin America. So the same theorists who are analyzing the political economy of U.S. imperialism in Latin America is also the political economy of U.S.-backed fascism. And I think that this kind of differentiation of understanding, a Marxist versus an idealist approach to understanding fascism is absolutely crucial. Because an idealist approach is one that is something, for example, that looks at, the idea of that there's psychological motives for this, or that it can be something that can be attributed to certain kinds of personalities. Or it's an approach that starts the analysis by looking just at the fascist ideology, rather than understanding how fascism emerges out of the political economy of capitalism and of imperialism. And this is something that then, an idealist approach leads us to misrecognize the sources of fascism and to be confused over not being able to recognize its agents. And if we take, its ideology first, we also misrecognize that fascism is, pragmatically uses ideology in different ways, depending on, where it is emerging within the capitalist world, and that it makes very eclectic uses of ideology, right? So against this, I've been particularly interested in looking at the Marxist analysis of fascism that understand it as coming out of, like I said, emerging from the political economy of imperialism, that were really developed by people who were communist militants who were struggling against it. So I'll be sharing a lot more of that research next week in the session that I'm doing with Eli. Thank you all very much.
Everybody feeling the vibes yet? I hope. So that's a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best to give a sense of my own research interests and agenda over the last few decades. And the first thing that I'd say is that a lot of the work that I do is inscribed within philosophy in the Marxist sense of that term, meaning an analysis, I said earlier, the social totality, but ultimately it's the socio-natural totality. We want to understand the totality of the material world, both natural and social, within which we live. Given that that's a tall order, I obviously have then specific focal points within that overall analysis. And I'd say that at the highest level, my work over the last decade or so has been focused on the question of empire and ideology. Empire being at the highest level of concrete abstraction, the objective conditions within which all subjects are situated. Meaning if you're a subject on planet Earth today, then you're subjected to the global imperialist order in various ways, shapes, and forms. Therefore, it has a bearing on your ideological composition. There are kind of three basic poles of research that I've developed. The first one I'm not going to go deep into because it overlaps with Jennifer, because we've been working on this together, and that is the field of cultural class struggle. I'll just say one or two things about that in a moment. The second is on fascism and how best to understand fascism. I think it's very clear to anyone who's paying attention that in the current phase of global capitalist crisis and the rising multipolar world, surprise, surprise, fascism is rising across the capitalist world. We need to be able to theorize it, understand it, and figure out how to fight it. But to fight it, you have to go to the root causes of it, and you have to understand it for what it actually is, not the kind of idealist forms or psychologizing forms that Jennifer was criticizing a moment ago. So I'll come back to this in a second. And then the third pole of research is on the Western left intelligentsia, or what I prefer to call the imperial intelligentsia. The intelligentsia that trained an ideological subject like myself, meaning the intelligentsia that has been ideologically conditioned to directly or indirectly promote and support the overall governing structures of global imperialism. Regarding the first point of cultural class struggle, one of the thematics that Jennifer didn't touch on, but is part of the larger research project that she mentioned, is that we're not only interested in criticizing the kind of bourgeois concept and practice of art insofar as it dominates the contemporary capitalist world, but we have a large section of the book that is focused on how art and culture, and we understand culture in the broad sense of the term, right? So culture includes theoretical work, art, writing, journalistic work. It's a very expansive understanding of culture. Culture is also a weapon of class struggle that's not only exercised from above, it's also exercised from below in order to engage in meaningful social transformation. And there are three different elements that we point out. And the best way I think of understanding them is in terms of two tactics and one strategy. If you're interested in cultural class struggle, one way of engaging in it is what we refer to as Trojan horse art or Trojan horse culture. This consists in recognizing that, at least within the capitalist world, the ruling class owns and controls the means of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. Therefore, the entire system is in the hands of the ownership class. If you want to get a message out there that is about expropriating the expropriators, then you've got a tall order. You've got a problem on your hands. You've got a fundamental contradiction. Trojan horse art and culture tries to solve that contradiction by smuggling into the dominant cultural apparatus a message that conflicts with its fundamental orientation and imperatives. If you know the work of Boots Riley, I think one of the greatest US American artists currently, both his music, his filmmaking, his TV shows, etc., he's a great example, at least at one level, a film like Sorry to Bother You is a film that got an amazing level of distribution and is palatable to the dominant cultural apparatus. The message happens to be that we need to understand the racializing dynamics in the history of capitalism, and we need to dispossess the owners of the means of production, have a revolution, in order to overcome not only capitalism, but also its racializing dynamics. You don't usually get that on Netflix or on Amazon Prime. So it's a great example of Trojan horse art or culture. Another example that we point to is counter-hegemonic art and culture, which is focused not on smuggling a message in, because if you smuggle a message in, you've got to make sacrifices to get your message across. Counter-hegemonic art and culture seeks to develop its own alternative system of cultural production, distribution, and consumption. And so all of the artists and cultural producers who are doing this in various ways and forms contribute to that. Third Cinema would be a great example of it. What we're trying to do in our own small way by having a cultural apparatus that nonetheless is inscribed within the larger kind of university world would be another example thereof. But ultimately, these are just tactics, meaning they're stepping stones. If we're serious about democratizing culture, putting it in the hands of the people so that people can make art that improves their lives in various ways, then we ultimately need state power. We need, instead of a capitalist apparatus of cultural production owned by the ruling class, we need a socialist apparatus of cultural production. So there's also part of this work that looks at places like Cuba, which of course is an easy go-to example because culture is and was at the very beginning at the absolute center of the Cuban revolutionary project, as it is at the core of every meaningful revolutionary project, but the Cubans of course are renowned for that. I'll leave cultural class struggle at that though for the time being to focus then on the second pole of research, and that is on fascism. One distinction that I think is particularly helpful is one that Friedrich Engels made in some of his work between a metaphysical approach and a dialectical approach. Metaphysical approach assumes that there's this entity called fascism that has a pure form to it that could be defined once and for all. Starting point of metaphysics is idealist. You begin with an idea and you assume that it's ideas that somehow govern the world. A dialectical analysis begins the other way around. It begins with the complex processes that compose the world, and it raises the important question of how can we best conceptualize those processes to make sense of them. One of the problems with a metaphysical approach to fascism is that it has been largely integrated into a kind of bourgeois understanding of what fascism is. And this understanding really obscures fundamental dynamics in the contemporary world And you see this not only in right-wing literature on fascism, but on a lot of the left-wing, including some Marxist accounts or purportedly Marxist accounts of fascism. One thing that the bourgeois concept of fascism does is it tends to render it exceptional. Fascism is something that happened in Germany, or Italy, if you want to take that as your starting point. Perhaps it only occurred once or twice in history, but one thing is clear: it was defeated by the democratic powers of the West, and in particular, the United States. This ideology of fascist exceptionalism communicates very powerfully that fascism under capitalism is a complete aberration. It's a singular phenomenon. And if there are attempts to extend the category of fascism beyond the exemplar of Nazism and eventually Italian fascism, then usually those attempts are always related back to Nazism. So if you look at contemporary phenomena, for instance, I don't know, the Azov battalion in the Ukraine, when people see people with swastikas tattooed on their necks, they're like, oh, that's fascism, right? But if they didn't have the swastika and were doing the exact same thing, paid by the same people, plugged into the same imperial forces, somehow it wouldn't be fascism. So the ideology of fascist exceptionalism serves to invisibilize the presence of fascist modalities of political governance under capitalism. And it severs, very importantly, the fascist forms of political management that emerged in the early 20th century from their deep colonial history. As Aimé Césaire, of course, famously said, well, all of a sudden, everyone makes a big deal out of concentration camps when they happen in Europe. But if we know our colonial history, fascism has been the history of colonialism, and concentration camps have been very widespread. And so there's a Eurocentric exceptionalism that also clouds the deep history of colonial violence. And as we know from Marx and other sources, capital came into this world dripping head to toe in blood and dirt, right? Because capital came into the world through processes of so-called primitive accumulation in which colonial violence was unleashed on the victims of capital in a way at least akin to things that you would see later with the Nazis and in Italian fascism. And it's also very important to know that the Italian case and the Nazi case, these were colonial projects through and through. That was their goal. There were, of course, Italian colonies in Africa, and the whole goal of the Nazi Third Reich was to have Lebensraum in the East, and it was very explicitly modeled on what historical example? The wild, wild west of the US settler colony. And the Nazis studied the US case as the cutting edge of racial apartheid in their time because they wanted to apply that model in their own case. So we have to be able to see the continuities, which does not mean that you just erase everything and say, well, Nazism and settler colonial violence in the United States is the exact same thing. Dialectical analysis always looks at the specificity of particular conjunctures, but brings to the fore elements of deep, deep continuity while also highlighting some of the differences. It's also important, of course, that the United States entered the Second World War very late and then proceeded before the end of the war to begin integrating Italian fascists, Nazis, and Japanese fascists into a veritable fascist international through its national security state, integrating tens of thousands of fascists. And this is all not only very well documented, but it's spelled out in internal documents. So it's not only third-party researchers who have pointed this out, we have this from the first-person testimony itself. The other thing that is important to highlight regarding the bourgeois concept of fascism is just as it renders it exceptional in the case of capitalist countries, the enemies of empire are often ubiquitously or systematically or near systematically labeled as fascists. This, of course, was done in earnest in the case of the Soviet Union. It was an ally during World War II, which defeated fascism, right? It was under Stalin that fascism was defeated. It wasn't the US. It was the some 35 million Soviets and 20 million Chinese who gave their lives fighting fascism. That's why we're not speaking German and France right now. It's because the Red Army defeated fascism. But one of the things that was undertaken through propaganda campaigns was labeling the communists the real fascists, or just as bad as the fascists, through the concept of totalitarianism. And if you speed up to the contemporary era, of course, we see time and again that those countries, even that aren't socialist, but that provide a bulwark against the spread of imperialism, are labeled fascist or Hitler-like, etc. And there are many examples that one could point to, of course. In this regard, I think it's important to reject both the ideology of fascist exceptionalism in the case of capitalism and the ideology of fascist overgeneralization in the case of the enemies of capitalism, and instead engage in a materialist analysis that brings together at least three different levels. One is a conjunctural analysis. A conjunctural analysis always focuses on a specific time and place. So you can do, and there are very good conjunctural analyses of Nazi Germany, for instance. But a conjunctural analysis, if you're systemic about it, also has to be related to a structural analysis. If you look at the capitalist world in the wake of the Great Depression, you will find that there were fascist movements in every capitalist country. Therefore, this wasn't exceptional or odd or an aberration, what happened in Germany or Italy. In 1934, there was a fascist coup that was planned for the United States. And the McCormick-Dickstein Committee investigated this and found beyond a doubt that there was a conspiracy on the part of the capitalist ruling class, including DuPont, Morgan, and some of the biggest families in the capitalist ruling class, to establish a fascist dictatorship in the United States. In that regard, we need to relate any conjunctural analysis to a structural analysis, meaning an analysis of particular phases of capitalist accumulation across the board and around the world. And ultimately, that has to be situated at the highest level of concrete abstraction, and that is a systemic analysis. We have to be able to analyze how the socioeconomic mode of production, known as capitalism, has brought with it and continues to constantly recreate fascist or fascistic modalities of political governance. Which of course relates to my earlier reference to the deep colonial history of capitalism and how it is tied to fascism. The final thing that I'd say just regarding this, and then I want to highlight an additional point and wrap up and we can open up for questions, is that another difficulty with the bourgeois concept of fascism is that it often assumes that the true opposite of fascism is liberalism. And at a certain level of concrete abstraction, meaning concrete abstraction, I simply mean you look at all the facts, you abstract from them, but you remain concrete, meaning you remain anchored in the facts. You don't do a speculative abstraction where you just go off into Netherland and you invent concepts like empire or coloniality of power that are ultimately untethered from material reality in very, very significant ways. So as you concretely abstract, it is true that maintaining bourgeois democratic rights and the modes of political management under liberalism can be a bulwark against certain forms of fascism. But if you abstract at a higher level, you recognize something that's absolutely essential to recognize. And this goes against the dominant literature on fascism. People like Jason Stanley, whose father worked for the CIA, just so everyone knows. Jason Stanley wrote a very important book on fascism, which is, in my opinion, a very poor liberal account of what fascism purportedly is. And what this liberal approach misses is that liberalism is ultimately a mode of political management under capitalism, and fascism is too. And if you know the material histories of liberalism and fascism, they sometimes operate with conflicts, but they often operate with a deep, deep level of complicity, because at the end of the day, they have the same strategy. They're headed in the same direction. They want to maintain and ideally intensify global capitalist social relations. Now, liberalism has a way of doing it while, preserving rights for select groups of people, never truly universalizing them. Whereas fascism, of course, is gloves off and getting rid of bourgeois democratic rights. So I think it's very important to defend bourgeois democratic rights and liberalism against fascism. while recognizing that if we're serious about fighting fascism and want to defeat it, the only real way of doing that is changing the socio-economic mode of production that is the seedbed and the source of fascism. Meaning, you have to overcome capitalism if you want to get rid of fascism. And the problem with the bourgeois concept of fascism is it misdirects us to just embracing another mode of capitalist political management. Just scrolling through a few notes here, the final thing that I'd like to say is that I'm going to have plenty of opportunity, including with Emmerich this week, to talk a little bit more about the Western left intelligentsia and how it's positioned within all of this. The only thing that I'd like to highlight now is that the approach that I think is the most coherent to understanding intellectual production within the imperial core is to not remain at the subjective level. This relates directly to what Jennifer was saying about an objective instead of a subjective ideology critique. A subjective ideology critique would consist in saying such and such a person is ideologically indoctrinated, here's why, and you can prove it. That can be very helpful because there are ideologically indoctrinated subjects, but it only gets you so far. The real question is, well, why are they ideologically indoctrinated? And why is it that so many subjects operating within the same system reach more or less the exact same, or are imbued with more or less the exact same forms of ideology? An objective ideological critique examines the material systems of intellectual production, distribution, and consumption that compose ideological subjects and condition how they think, how they act, how they speak, how they feel, how they perceive, their sense of history, their sense of possibility, and many other things. It's important to note that this is a process of conditioning and not one of rigorous determination. The relationship between a material system and the subjects within it is not mechanical. It's not that there's a big system and then it just pumps out little subjects who do their bidding. It's that there's a system that conditions the very acts that are performed within that system, and it tends to reward particular types of acts and demote others. And that organic and dialectical relationship between subjects and systems is ultimately what we need to understand for an objective ideological critique. And so as you'll see in the next two sessions, actually, we're going to look both at two of the foundational discourses that have contributed to the contemporary versions of radical theory that you have in the academy, in the imperial core, and through cultural imperialism. This has been spread around the world. One is French theory, and the other is what people call Western Marxism, or the forms of Marxism that are dominant within the imperial core. But in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here. Let's do this. We'll start with 2 rounds of questions. We can start in the room. We do have, for recording and online purposes, a mic. So start by raising your hand, and then say what your name is. Provide us with a concise question. We'll take 3 or 4 questions. We'll take notes on them, brief responses from the 2 of us, and then we'll do another round online of brief questions, and we'll keep going in sequence like that. So, with no further ado, we can raise hands to get the ball rolling. Yeah, Luke one. Oh, and we also have anyone who asks a question, there's 2 mics. So the mics in this room, you just press down on them, and there's that mic. You don't have to do anything. You just talk into that mic. But Wojciech, could you just turn that mic on next to you and then point it in Luke's direction? Did the red light come on? Perfect. Yeah, keep it on though. The red light has to be on. Perfect.
All right. I'm Luke. I was going to ask, speaking on kind of the postmodernist decolonial theory, do you see kind of parallels in the ways in which like the theories of the Frankfurt School were promoted by, say, like the CIA and, different things like the Ford Foundation, that sort of thing? And are those sort of, and how those academics advanced, do you see parallels between that and or I guess explicit parallels between that and the ways in which the postmodernist decolonial theory is promoted today, like if there are specific material forces that can be pointed to that are driving the promotion of that theory, like you would see with the CIA of that time.
Let's take a round.
Oh, yeah, I'll take a round.
Yeah. Are there others? Did I freak everyone out by asking them to be concise? Emma, could you turn that microphone off?
This one, you said?
Both.
Oh,
both.
I use this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Am I
You're
hearable?
on.
Okay.
You're live.
I don't have the question solidly formulated, so I have like a topic that I want you all to, or I'm requesting you all to talk more about. But specifically about, because it's just something that I'm kind of like thinking through about the conversations about race and racism being within the ethnic studies, at least the hegemonic version of it being like that you're purely fighting for representation, right? Recently, especially recently politically, I've been hearing about how different Zionist organizations are starting to infiltrate these ethnic studies departments as a way to claim Zionism as an identity, as opposed to Jewish studies or something like that. Well, the same thing with Jewish studies. I think they're also sort of coming in that way also. So I wonder if you know more about this trend, or if you want to say something about, like, I'm interested in like the connections between, there's like an attempt to reify the identity of Zionism so incomplete, but something like that I'd be curious about.
Zach, I was wondering if you can expand on the Trojan horse art and culture approach. I think of something like, I saw a video of the other day of George Lucas saying that basically Star Wars was an anti-imperialist thing, but I don't know of one Star Wars fan that sees it that way, So I just wonder, like, how do you do it effectively?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Should we take another one or two?
Well, I guess more about the materialist analysis. I'm curious, how would you define the methodology as distinct from like contextualist intellectual history? That's kind of like taught sort of
I'm sorry, I
mainstream.
missed one word.
How would you define the materialist analysis as against like contextualist intellectual history, which to me sounds quite similar, right?
Gotcha. Should we do one more? Yeah. Go ahead. Seema, you're in control. Go ahead. One more, and then we'll.
I think mine's basically been covered, so someone else.
I'll go back to you.
Okay.
Is one of these recording and one of them is projecting? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. This
You don't have to
That's
talk
just
that close.
recording.
Yeah.
This
You don't
recording.
have to talk that
That
close
one's
to it.
projecting.
Yeah. You don't have to just talk. You don't have to be
Sorry.
close to it.
Yes. This I was thinking about the second essay about the compositional model of ideology, and was just curious about if in indigenous practices and of world making can provide a kind of a tool for this further kind of study and contestation of ideology as defined in a compositional way, as kind of as in the essay, and if that kind of requires perhaps a reconceptualization of indigeneity. That's more or less my question.
Okay.
Do you want to take whatever one?
Sure. Great. Thank you guys for these great questions. I'll take a few of them and then you could go take whatever else. I think, Luke, your question about similarities between decolonial theory and Western Marxism is a great question. And I would say that, I haven't, they're certainly very similar at the level of being theoretical products that are very much, promoted, that are whose kind of global reach has, you can be attributed to them being promoted by the institutions of, the U.S. ruling class. And this is something actually in regard to decolonial theory that the Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui wrote about well over a decade ago, when she identified decolonial theory as a product of U.S. cultural imperialism. She said, she talks about it as a kind of product. This is just a quote from one of her essays. She says, the cultural studies departments of North American universities have adopted these ideas of, have launched debates in Latin America, creating a jargon, a conceptual apparatus, and forms of reference and counter-reference that have isolated academic treatises from any obligation to a dialogue with insurgent social forces. She says, Walter Mignolo and company have built a small empire within an empire, strategically appropriating the contributions of subaltern studies schools and very Latin American variants and their critical reflections on decolonization. So she, I think insofar as understanding, she really identified it as a product of U.S. cultural imperialism. In terms of, it's the actual, like, if it's promoted, by State Department actors and things, I haven't done that kind of research into really the kind of the sociology of this knowledge production, but it certainly is, promoted by these very powerful gatekeepers. And I think there's also some very important similarities also between decolonial theory and some of the characteristics of Western Marxism that we wrote about, that Losurdo identifies in his book on Western Marxism, that Gabriel and I wrote about also in our introduction that you guys read to that English translation of that book. And that includes, for example, this very sort of messianic approach towards thinking of social transformation. This idea that social change is going to, that what we are seeking is a world that is nothing like the one that we currently live in, and that it has to somehow, we can't arrive at it through sort of the extant institutions, but it has to kind of arrive on the scene more or less miraculously. I think that that is kind of one of the similarities. You also really see the kind of suspicion towards projects to take state power, and of course going hand in hand with its anti-Marxism. That is something that you also see between a really strong similarity between decolonial theory and a lot of forms of Western Marxism. So I think, and there's also this kind of populism that characterizes, probably more than anything, I think it's the populism that really characterizes decolonial theory, that also links it to a lot of Western Marxism that we, characteristics of Western Marxism that Losurdo identifies. And this is a kind of characteristic that, where an intellectual puts themselves as sort of in the position of defending an oppressed people, but without being able to scientifically identify what the actual source of that oppression is, and that they're only on the side of the oppressed only as long as they're losing. But as soon as they might do something like organize themselves in a way to seek state power, then they fall out of favor with the decolonial theorist, for example. So I think those are some really strong similarities. And in terms of I think what you said about Tiffany, about Zionism, I think that's really, really interesting. And it's, I don't know as much about like the role, I guess, of Zionism infiltrating ethnic studies departments, which I'd really be really interested in seeing. But I think it's such an important point that you're talking about. I mean, because we've seen all of these efforts of, to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or to conflate Zionism with Jewish identity, which is, actually profoundly anti-Semitic. As it's incorrect, of course, to, equate a people or culture or religion with a political ideology, and of course puts Jewish people at great danger to do that. So I think that, but it's what you're pointing at, I think, is a really interesting sort of and very insidious use of this kind of, I guess, tendency to sort of treat essentialized cultural identities as like an object of defense, and that being this kind of default position of the kind of liberal politics of the academy that is then can clearly be taken advantage of and utilized by this colonial imperialist project. So I just think, I mean, I think it's an incredibly important thing to understand, though I don't know more about like the concrete ways in which it's happening.
I just heard this more so, I think I've heard it more so on like the West Coast and like some of like the schools in California. But I think we could also see this, and maybe this is more relevant with like Title VI and Title IX, well,
Yeah.
Title VI cases, right? And
Yeah.
it sounds like from your summary, like opening up like the ethnic studies, the origins of it being from the civil rights
Yeah.
struggles, and same thing with Title VI, right? Its origins were from the civil rights struggles, and then, but it's through. So I guess that's where it's happening first, right? Is like it's for like Zionism is trying to change definitions or include themselves into these Title VI cases.
Yeah.
And then I've also seen it like on a smaller scale, or heard about it on a smaller scale happening in like maybe in some like California state schools or something like that. But definitely, but that's where I made that connection, was when you talked about like civil rights being the origins of these things. Same thing with Title VI, right? The origins were from these civil rights.
And perhaps also,
Politics, yeah.
No, and just you saying that, perhaps also one of the similarities that you can see is this kind of, when you confuse a political project with a cultural identity, and where on one hand you're seeing that, like this confusion between that and this conflation of Zionism and a Jewish identity, whereas you have, on the other end, like confusing the political project that was the foundation of building these departments, for example, with simply just being something about treating a cultural identity, which can itself often lend itself to right-wing projects. I mean, there's some of the, like Ben Olguin, who I'm co-editing this anthology on Latino Marxism, has written about kind of the ways in which, like the nationalist tendencies, the ways in which the institutionalization of Chicano studies really institutionalizes nationalized tendencies against the more radical politics that were actually part of the movement when it founded it, has meant that these departments now can lend themselves to much more right-wing projects than probably would have ever been conceived of in their founding. I'll hand it over to you so you can take some of the other questions.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Tiffany, just to pick up on one thing, and that is that you see when a lot of the radical movements of the 60s were pushing in many different directions, but what ultimately got recuperated in the academy in many ways were the various forms of, what would become identity politics, but was, black nationalist or various forms of nationalism in that time. And you see very clearly in the contemporary cases that identity politics, since it only operates at a representational level and doesn't engage with an actual materialist analysis of class relations, lends itself just as well to right-wing identity politics, pro-Zionist identity politics as any other. And there you see the real limits of a representational approach. And it's one of the reasons that it's become so dominant. I think it's also telling that Fayez Sayegh, made an argument to the UN that Zionism is a form of racism, and the UN has a declaration on it. So at least according to the United Nations, if you're a Zionist, you're a racist. And so the idea that you'd be an anti-Zionist, therefore you'd be an anti-racist. But what they're trying to do is invert that, right, and make anti-Zionists into racists. And they do that through the obfuscation of identity politics. So I think it's a really, really important point. Concerning the Trojan horse politics, George Lucas or Avatar or other examples that we could think of, I think there are two things to say. One is it really depends on the politics that are being marshaled. And George Lucas is not advocating for a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism in the name of global socialism, at last I checked. And that's one aspect. But another is that in doing a materialist analysis of culture, you always need a variegated account of reception. And so if a particular cultural product is marshaling a political agenda, it doesn't necessarily mean that all people consuming that will be lined up on that political agenda, right? And so in that regard, all of the politics of art needs to be analyzed in such a way that it breaks with what Jennifer is referring to as the talisman complex. The idea that each work of art would have magical properties, and this is what would, produce some type of political effect. That's not how it works. On the contrary, there are political initiatives within particular cultural products, but there's also the agency of the consumers of those products and the ideological baggage that some of them have in various ways, and it's that confrontation that really needs to be mapped out. Just as you could also say people would go and see Boots Riley's film and say, hey, that was funny and that was cool, and not actually get that he's calling for a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Regarding materialism, I'd say that it's not the same thing as contextualism insofar as one of the dominant methodological divisions that you see within the bourgeois academy is between the social sciences that tend to encourage forms of what people call external analysis or contextualization. So you take a cultural product and you look at it sociologically or historically or economically, versus internal analysis, which tends to be the domain of the humanities. So if you take a philosophy class, you usually don't talk about the material relations of production of a particular text, you just read the text. And if you take an art history class, you rarely talk about anything that would be external to the actual work of art itself. And so you see within the bourgeois humanities and the bourgeois social sciences actually a bifurcation of the world. And here I'm painting in broad strokes. Of course, there are exceptions and people trying to push in various directions. But in general, you do internal analysis by assuming that the cultural artifact is separate from the world, or you engage in a form of contextualization because you identify the driving forces as being external to the cultural product. A materialist analysis, and materialism in general, rejects the binary division of the world between a kind of ideal realm of subjective production and an external empirical realm of the outside world. Right? And so materialism, as Marx and Engels wrote, for instance, in the German ideology, but there are many other good examples of this, is neither empiricism nor idealism. Empiricism assumes there are brute facts of the world, we can analyze them, understand, garner truth from them. Idealism assumes, well, truth comes from the human mind or from a spirit world or from God. That's the source of truth. Materialism says, no, these are false starting points. It's not that there's just an outside world or an inside world. It's that subjective forms of cultural production always take place within a broader empirical world. So materialist analysis engages in a dialectical account of subject and system, to put it simply, or of, if we use these reified oppositional terms, it both looks at what the cultural producer as an individual put into it, but then also the whole system that produced that cultural producer and within which that cultural product circulates, if that makes sense. The question of the indigenous practices in world making, I do think that the compositional model of ideology is trying to get at the ways in which ideology is not just about a set of ideas that someone would have. And so you could sit down and have coffee with someone and be like, okay, I'm going to get rid of your ideology today, and I'm going to tell you how the world really works. Usually those are blowhards who try to do that. I mean, you can have a good argument and try to convince someone, but ideology is a multifaceted phenomenon that composes us in every dimension of our existence. And if we're serious about ideology critique, we need to recognize that it's not just our thoughts, it's our desires, our affects, our perceptions. All of these compose us in such a way that you also can't just leap out of ideology. One of the things you see constantly in bourgeois cultural production is the idea that you can press a magic button and get out of ideology. It's the red, blue, or the blue pill. It's you press a button, you take a drug. It's going through the looking glass. Like all of these metaphors are for a magical leap into another world. That doesn't happen that easily because you've been materially composed in every dimension of your existence, and the process of recomposition not only takes time, but it requires all of these different aspects of you to be recomposed. And so I say all of that to highlight the fact that if you really want to get a clear sense of ideological differences, then if you look at, indigenous cultures in the Americas prior to the arrival of the colonial powers from Europe, their ideological composition was obviously quite markedly different than after the arrival of Europeans. And having a kind of more anthropological account of the deep history of the composition of human beings allows us to concretely abstract it so that we can see it at a higher and higher level and understand that, no, there are people who really do feel differently, who think really differently because of the way in which they've been materially composed. So I might have gone on a little length, but these are really great questions. So let's do another round, but we'll do it online. Maybe you could just use the raise hand function. And Jared, do you just want to moderate and we'll do the same thing with 4 or 5 questions?
Sounds good. There was already a question from Joao. And he wanted to just maybe field it, speak. Joao, are you ready to pose a question?
Yeah. Can
Yes.
Okay, thank you everyone. Great talks. I'm happy to participate again in a great view workshop. And my comment is regards the notion of fascism and liberalism. And I think Gabriel put all the pieces almost there, they are at hand in your talk. But I have a question in regard, because as you put it, historically we can see in liberalism fascistic dimensions through colonialism and apartheid, and afterwards when the notions that are in bourgeois scholarship are regarded as fascism, as the hallmark of fascism, Italy and Germany, they are, like Losurdo says, they are looking at the US, at England, all these levels. So I do agree, and something that I have been thinking for a while, that liberalism and fascism, they have the same strategy. Their goal is the same end goal, but they operate as two different ethics, if I could put it. But I think there's a historical leap in which liberalism, when before fascism emerges as this concept, before the struggles of socialists became so strong and erupted with the October Revolution, the Soviet Union, fascism was embedded in liberalism. So liberalism was colonialism, was apartheid. There was no notion of liberalism in the sense of today as identity politics, in the sense of liberal socialism, or socialist chauvinism, and all these aspects. So the term liberalism itself changes as the practice changes. So it's not that fascism is something completely heterogeneous. It's that as if a new division of labor emerges within the imperialist core. Or you could say the two tactics. And you can see, for instance, the example of Chile, I think is great because you have all liberals and neoliberals supporting the Chilean coup d'etat with Pinochet to put in place a ruthless fascistic government. Or you can see today with the Zionist regime in Israel actually for a long time, but they operate as classical liberalism. But they are fascistic through and through. There's no doubt about it. They don't have to have the symbols of Nazi Germany, of Italian fascism. But the liberalism that they hold dear is fascistic. I think there's no doubt about that. So just about this leap, I think is interesting because historically it's not that liberalism is completely different, but there was this division of labor, new division of labor, let's put it like that. So if you could comment, please.
We can take another question?
Yeah, Jared, we can go ahead and take like 4 or 5. So.
Okay, next is Laura. I've shown people if they want to type it in, but I think they're anxious to maybe speak. So Laura, and then Ayabulela, and then Nico, and Gabriella is the queue. Laura, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm so excited about this conference. At the risk of raising what is possibly a contentious and overly narrow topic, but has to do with cultural politics within the context of imperialism, I think we can all agree that sex-based cultural rules were part and parcel of the tactic that materially oppressed women as a sex vis-a-vis our reproductive capacity, and have also pigeonholed men and women into specific material and cultural roles that are harmful, and that feminists have spent decades trying to eliminate these roles and stereotypes as they are destructive. So my question is, how can we confront the idealistic reification of the role of women that has morphed into gender ideology, to understand it, that gender ideology serves to intensify these destructive roles while demoting women through reification in a way that rejects and hides material oppression of women, while also recognizing that gender stands in contradiction to material reality, and that this recognition is not bigotry or transphobia.
All right. Ayabulela, you want to pose a question really quickly? And when you're done posing your question, just please mute yourselves. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am uncomfortable, however, with this clean distinction between, cultural theory, or what you're calling nationalism, and Marxist theory, given that even with the inceptions, say, of Black Marxist critique by Cedric Robinson, I think Jessica spoke about or alluded to the idolization of Cedric Robinson. He begins his critique of capital by noting that capitalism as a movement, as an economic and colonial revolution within Europe, is not isolated from various cultural and nationalist productions of that, of that machinery, right? And even when you investigate like the history of colonialism, colonial capitalism, that entire machinery, that entire apparatus is powered by, the imperial state itself, right? So even when you think about the Dutch East India Company, or you think about various, sort of like economic drives in the transatlantic slave trade, those weren't isolated. That mode of capitalism at its inception wasn't isolated from national/imperial, an imperial machine that backed it up, that energized it. So how do you make this clean sort of like distinction or binary in the critique without also acknowledging that culturalism or nationalism and capitalism arise as intersecting and, a kind of like two-edged sword type of apparatus, if that makes sense. And I think that part of the critical race theory sort of, line of thought, or even within critical cultural studies, somewhat recognizes that you can't isolate either the production or the processes of capital without also critiquing or having an understanding of how it is so highly imbricated with European nationalism. The entire structure of imperialism is not merely capitalist. I think even, European critiques like Marx and Lenin themselves come to this understanding. So, yeah, I just want to know how you factor that into your critique of what you're calling in your paper the theory industry, or the pure nationalism that sort of obfuscates us from capital and class critique.
And finally, Nico, if I'm saying that correctly, if you want to jump in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a question about the framework on the analysis of ideology, and it's the question of infrastructures, which I think is sometimes under-theorized in some materialist analysis, and something funny considering that it has been at the center of many social struggles, including recent ones. There's good examples in France, but also in Latin America and elsewhere, where the main focus of struggle were like blocking, sabotaging, transforming, reclaiming the infrastructures of capital. And so at every step of the supply chain. So my question is, how do you frame, is this relevant or not for your analysis of ideology? Does it play a role or not, the composition of space through certain infrastructures, material infrastructures? Thank you.
And then finally, Gabriella, are you there? You said you wanted to pose a question? Gabriella?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, so thank you. I am also very interested in fascism, and I'm focusing my research on the manifestations of fascism in the Americas. And I was interested in, I wanted to ask a question to Gabriel about, you end your talking about the idea of indoctrination, the ideological indoctrination, which is, I think, one example of how, from a liberal perspective, these neo-fascist movements sometimes are explained, which is interesting because if you study the far right in the Americas, for example, or in Brazil or Argentina, they use the idea of ideological indoctrination to attack democracy or to attack other groups, not so the idea of attacking education or even liberal education to kind of advance their reactionary project. So I wonder to what extent the idea of ideological indoctrination is useful for understanding or analyzing the far right or these new manifestations of fascism, especially in the Americas. And how would you approach this idea of ideological indoctrination for understanding these neo-fascist manifestations? Thank you.
Sure.
All right, if you got Gabriel, Jen, Max, we're good to have some responses if you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. Briefly, Joao, I think what you said was really interesting, and I'm sure Gabriel will have a lot more to say about it, but one of the things that it made me think about when you talk about this kind of shift in the relationship between liberalism and fascism, and I think one of the things I'm particularly interested in is also the way, that the U.S. exercises fascism by proxy, right? So, on one hand, we have kind of like the apartheid state of the U.S. in the early 20th century is an explicit model for, European fascism, and it's, the racial immigration laws of the U.S., all of these things. Of course, after World War II, after the Convention on Genocide, and as well as after, the end of formal apartheid in the U.S., these kinds of practices are not, accepted, these, more socially accepted in the same way they were earlier in this century. But what you do then see, of course, is much more of this, again, exercise of fascism by proxy, by having the U.S. that positioning itself as the kind of global beacon of democracy in the world, while it is, funding death squads, overthrowing governments, putting fascists in power, etc. So I think that kind of shift in the form of political management, what you said about that is really, really interesting. To the question about Cedric Robinson, about nationalism, the emergence of capitalism was not separate from the emergence of nationalism. While that is true, they're not the same kind of thing. And I think part of what I was saying about how this kind of, going back to that quote from Marx that says it's necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production and the ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. And that distinction, I think, is absolutely crucial. Like class struggles, the kind of actual struggles over the means and resources that ensure life, whether that's labor, it's the reproductive powers of the natural world, it's people's bodies and their reproductive powers. Those have a material reality that race does not. Race is an invented concept. The ideology has, had traction in the world because of the way that it has been plugged into and utilized within the capitalist system that has given it made it a very real aspect and has made racialization and racial hierarchization a very real aspect of the way that the capitalist world system works. But we can't forget that race, of course, is an invented concept. It is not, there are not differences among the human species. It is not the same category of thing as class. And that also means that it can't be given the same kind of explanatory power that class struggle offers us, right? That's the difference, and that's like the difference would be saying something like, we know through the work of many historians, whether that's Eric Williams or Barbara Fields, that the modern ideology of race emerges from the practice of modern slavery, not the other way around. Slavery doesn't emerge from racist ideas, right? Those racist ideas emerge from the practice of slavery, and that is a crucial distinction. And so that's kind of, and that also means, it's also what that means for how you're going to fight it, right? If the idea is that racist practices emerge simply from people having bad ideas, then you end up with these kinds of explanations that I think you get in some, you get in work like in some of Cedric Robinson's statements about this idea that there's just this trans-historical racism that's rooted in Western civilization, that's rooted in some essence that is attributed to European civilization or to white people that itself is not explained, right? That this idea of where, if you attribute these racist practices just to a consciousness, you're treating that consciousness in an ahistorical manner, projecting it across history, and never explaining where it emerges from. So that, I think, is, a very crucial distinction. And I think, and this notion that, that these are racism and capitalism were intersecting forces. Again, we have to distinguish between the, ideological forms that come to justify forms of superexploitation, slavery, and national oppression, and the actual, class struggles that are underlying the emergence of these things. Marta Jimenez, who is a sociologist, her critiques of intersectionality do a wonderful job of talking about why intersectionality has really muddled this as a framework, has really muddled this distinction between the difference between kind of the basis of social conflicts and the ideological ways in which they're experienced. So I would really highly recommend her writing on that. But I think it's one of the problems with this kind of metaphor of intersecting forces, because then if we're just saying, well, all these things are intersecting, ideologies as well as practices of exploitation, we again lose any distinction between the difference between these actual material practices and the various ideological forms in which they're experienced. I would also say that, it is absolutely true that, as you said, that national oppression has been an absolutely important part of the history of modern capitalism. And that's something, of course, that, the Marxist-Leninist tradition has taken very, very seriously. That is a huge aspect of, if you read Lenin on the national question and the insistence on the understanding that, in the context of imperialism, class struggles take the form also of oppressor nations oppressing peoples, right? And that is, why the insistence on national self-determination was such an absolutely crucial part, of the entire Leninist tradition. And I think, one of the things that I find so insidious about Cedric Robinson's work in particular, and I'm talking about that book, Black Marxism, is it is profoundly anti-Leninist and profoundly misrepresents the history of Marxism. It doesn't acknowledge the importance of the struggles against national oppression that are such an important aspect, of that tradition, not only on paper, but in the reality of all of these national liberation struggles that have struggled against colonialism, using Marxism as a key tool for doing that. And so the kind of arguments that Robinson puts forth in that book, which are essentially saying that, he argues that Marxism is a tool that's not adequate to talk about the struggles of Black people, is, I think, wrong, but also is, invisibilizing the history of the fact that it has been used as a key struggle by colonized people, including Black people, in struggles for national liberation. I would really highly recommend, in terms of critiques of that book, Black Marxism, I'd really highly recommend Cedric Johnson's recent writing on it, called an essay called The Wrong Durée, as well as the essay by Salvador Rangel, Hilburn Watson, and William I. Robinson. There's an essay called The Cult of Cedric Robinson, and they just published a reply to critics. And I think those essays do an excellent job of critiquing that book, as did, some of the essays that came out when that book was first published in the 80s, like August Nimp's really important work, where he characterized that book as a kind of an example, very sophisticated example of Black nationalism. I'll end there and pass it over to you.
Great. We're arriving at the end of our time in case everyone's getting hot or tired, but I'll try to just touch on a few points. And the first thing that I'd say is these questions are all so rich that we could all spend hours talking about each of them. Fortunately, we have 3 weeks. Fortunately, it's a big city and there's bottles of wine and a river and other places to have informal conversations. So part of the workshop, and this will also hopefully take place online, in some capacity if you enjoy drinking alone in front of your screen, or if you just want to engage with some type of, scholarly exchange. So the goal here isn't to exhaust these questions. It's to give you a lot of food for thought so that everybody can carry these conversations forward. So with no further ado, Joao, really interesting point that we could and should talk more about. I would highlight 2 things that I think are important to the early 20th century's conjuncture and the emergence of what some people call classical fascism. One is the socialist threat, right? It's very clear that socialism caused the greatest possible threat to global imperialism in the history of imperialism, and there was a real serious threat of revolution in the imperial core. Jacques Powell's historical work is excellent on this. He said one of the reasons that you needed fascism was because of the threat of revolution. And that is an important part of that conjuncture. But the other thing that's key to know about the classical conjuncture of fascism is that these were all latecomers to the colonial feast. Germany, Italy, and Japan in the East. They wanted in on the colonial game. And that is quite different than what you get in the contemporary conjuncture, because if you understand World War I and World War II as 30 years of an inter-imperialist rivalry, that rivalry was won, but at great cost. It was won ultimately by the United States that became the leading imperialist power. But the great cost was that just as World War I had led to the Russian Revolution, not mechanically, but it was one of the instigating forces, World War II helped spark the anti-colonial revolutions and all of the socialist projects across the global south. And so when the United States inherited the kind of crown of global imperialism, it did it on its heels. Imperialism was losing. In the wake of World War II, there was a moment at which 2/5 of the world's population was living under a self-declared socialist government. That's a very different context than the context of the latecomers to the colonial feast. And one thing that we need to do to understand the contemporary manifestations of fascism is how they're related to the US as the grand overseer of the imperial project, and also the nature of its empire, because its empire is, among other things, an empire that's trying to hide itself under democracy promotion, forms of neocolonialism, covert operations, and other such things. The empire that often doesn't say its name. So there's a lot more to unpack there, but I welcome your encouragement to flesh out the material realities of our specific conjuncture and how it relates to these earlier manifestations. Laura, I'm not sure I completely grasped all of your question because there's a lot packed in. I would just say 2 things. One is that there's a big difference between a liberal approach to gender ideologies and a materialist analysis thereof. The liberal approach is the dominant one, so it's the representational model, the cultural model, etc. But a materialist approach to gender ideology recognizes that if you want to understand how gender ideology emerges, you have to look at the material social relations of production and reproduction. And historically, under capitalism, women have been subjected to social reproductive labor as what Lenin called domestic slaves, and they've also been subjected to forms of oppression as being treated as less than because they don't have the full dignity of a Homo sapien. In that regard, the materialist analysis recognized that if you want to fight against gender ideology, you have to fight against oppression, but also super exploitation, or the exploitation of women qua domestic slaves, and you have to break the fundamental nucleus of social reproduction under capitalism, which is the nuclear family, that imposes all of the social reproductive labor on women without a wage, but that is necessary to reproduce the worker and the new workers who are the children, and so it's an integral aspect of how capital functions. Ayabulela, I think that Jen touched on a lot of this. The only thing that I would mention is that I don't think that Jen was suggesting at all, or I definitely wouldn't suggest, that nations don't have their own material histories. It's that these nations have material histories that are largely a consequence of global colonial capital developments. And that needs to be understood and part of the overall discussion. Nico, on the issue of infrastructure, it seems like you understand in terms of the more widespread understanding of having systems of communication, transportation, distribution, and things like this. These elements of infrastructure definitely have an impact on ideology, but the core driving mechanism behind ideology is infrastructure in the Marxist sense, meaning the socioeconomic mode of production that undergirds, it's the way production's organized in a society, and based on how production is organized, you're going to be situated materially differently in it, and that's going to have a big impact on how you're composed, how you see the world, how you understand the world. And the final thing to conclude, Gabriella, really fundamental points that you raised, I do think that fascism is ultimately driven by the socioeconomic base, and we have to be very, very clear about that. It's not just an ideology that some wackos, psychos have, or a bad way of thinking, or how mean people approach the world because they don't accept otherness, or things like this. Fascism is driven by the socioeconomic mode of production that is capitalism, but at the same time, it mobilizes ideology and ideologies of indoctrination in a very, very important way, and we see that crystal clear right now. One of the things that fascist ideology is very good at doing is it identifies problems that most people have. Most people in the capitalist world are in, instead of ascension, they're in dissension, socially, economically, often also psychologically. They're alienated, they're disconnected, they're isolated, they're fearful, they live a precarious existence, they don't know if they're going to have a job in the future, they don't know if they're going to have a planet in the future. These are all very deep fears that I presume all of us share. They also don't know if World War III is going to happen and we're going to be nuked, or there'll be a nuclear winter and it's going to be lights out for everyone. All of that is integral to the historical conjuncture we're in, and hence part of our overall ideology, not in the negative sense, but in the broad sense of how we inhabit the world. But what fascists and fascist ideological production is very good at doing is taking those very real problems and finding false solutions to them. The false solutions generally come in the forms of scapegoating, in which it's identified that the real problem with U.S. culture or politics is the Chinese or the Mexicans or the immigrants from Latin America. Anybody but the capitalist ruling class. Anybody but the people who are actually responsible for creating these problems in the first place. And so fascism gives false solutions to very real problems. And so the ideological struggle against fascism, I think, needs to say yes to the problems and say, yes, you're alienated, you're disconnected, you're disgruntled, you're fragmented, you want a better world. But don't take the world that's being imposed on you by the bourgeois cultural apparatus. Know that the world that we need is a world different from the world that divides and conquers the global working class in order to better rule over them. So we have to be able to see through and pierce through the fascist ideology in order to go to the root causes and ultimately solve them. Because if we want a better world where it's not precarious, where there might be a future for humanity, where we might be able to have some level of solidarity and not attack and go after and be in these individual conflicts all the time, we need a world where people have healthcare and housing and education and care for one another, and part of a fabric, part of a society in which you have shared values. We don't have that. We have to build it. We don't have it in the capitalist world, I should say. We need to build it. And that is, I think, one of the core ways in which we fight fascism. Got a little fired up there, didn't I? Well, I'm excited to kick off the workshop with everyone, and excited about how wonderful the questions and comments were. I know there's more of them, but we're going to have 3 weeks together, so don't hesitate to, bring things up if we didn't get to them. People online, please take a little break and then come back, and Jared's going to run the show. Everyone else here, we're not going to do the, wine in the park today because of the drizzle, but if it's stocked, it's a short walk to the river, lots of places to buy wine if people want to informally gather and congregate. It's also a much more affordable option than some of the bars in the neighborhood. But in any case, we will be same time, same place tomorrow. So, and we'll have the reception afterwards, going to Luxembourg Gardens. So enjoy the evening, and we'll kick things off more informally tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thank you.